everyone, and welcome to our newest Idea Lab in this series. I'm Christine Thompson, Program Manager here at CGS. And before we begin, I want to, and as attendees filter in, I want to briefly review some webinar logistics that we'll need for today, and then I'll run through the agenda. So for today, please submit any questions you may have using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You're also invited to use the chat to discuss the webinar or post kudos or things you might want to learn with your fellow attendees, but please keep the conversations on topic and be respectful. Lastly, the recording and presentation slides will be emailed to registrants and posted on the IGE Hub website. That's here in the slide, and our CGS YouTube channel after the live event. Next slide, please. All right, for today's agenda, welcome and remarks from CGS, brief presentation by Janis Bush, a Q&A. We'll do announcements. We have a few upcoming opportunities in 2024, and then we should close out the meeting right at 3 p.m. So right now, I'll pass it over to Julia Kent to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Christine. My name is Julia Kent. I am a co-PI of the IGE Innovations in Graduate Education Hub and a vice president at the Council of Graduate Schools. I'd like to extend a special welcome to those of you who may not have attended an Idea Lab in the past, and just say a word or two about what the IGE Hub is before I introduce our speaker. So the Innovations in Graduate Education Hub is designed to create a network of IGE grantees, which is part of the NSF's graduate education portfolio, that is bigger and more impactful than the sum of its parts. The IGE program currently funds about 52 PIs and their teams at a diverse array of U.S. institutions to spark innovation in graduate education in STEM. And like many hubs that are organized by NSF, the IGE Hub, which CGS facilitates, helps facilitate conversation among the grantees, but also seeks to catalyze and accelerate innovation in graduate education by building bridges between the IGE grantees and the broader STEM graduate education community. For a while, the IGE Idea Labs, as they're called, which are 1-hour virtual meetings on graduate education and the innovations coming out of the hub, were for the IGE grantee community. And we have only just recently opened it to the broader community. And if you are not an IGE grantee, but may be interested in becoming one in the future, we are really glad you're here, and we look forward to your participation. So at this point, I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is an IGE grantee, Dr. Janis Bush, who is professor of integrative biology and director of the tree program at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Janis is the PI of an IGE grant titled Advancing and Strengthening Science Identity Through Systemic Training, or ASSIST. And the goals of her presentation today are all related to the topic of program assessment, which we realize that whether you're an IGE grantee or a researcher working outside that network is essential to any research project on STEM graduate education. So we hope that by the end of today's Idea Lab, you'll be able to identify a 12-step process in program assessment and evaluation, develop assessment criteria or refine them for your project, describe challenges in program assessment, and hopefully have some ideas for overcoming them, and then make meaningful recommendations for improvement of your programs. And this is a great topic if you're in the midst of a project, but also if you're just getting started and developing a proposal for funding. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Janis and thank her for her time. Janis?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be doing this. It's not always, I think, the first thing we think about when we're designing programs and writing grants, but definitely a very important part. I can go ahead and have the first slide, if you will, please. So if you would take a minute and maybe in the chat, if you could just tell me who you are and or where you're from and what your role is at your university. I can kind of get a little bit of a sense of who we have here today and what they're doing. So as I mentioned, program assessment and evaluation can sometimes be challenging, especially if we're not necessarily trained in these areas. And we'll talk a little bit about how to build a really strong team that you can use to help and make sure you have all your bases covered. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about myself and my university so you can get a sense of the playing field that I come from. I have over 40 years of experience at a minority serving institution, and I have my BS and MS in biology and a PhD in environmental science and engineering. I study plants, that's my main focus, but also do other things like butterflies, particularly the monarch butterfly right now, and other cool stuff. UT San Antonio, we go by UTSA, and we have almost 35,000 students. We are a Hispanic serving institution, and as you can see by the numbers, we have 59% of our students are Hispanic, and 45% are first gen. So we definitely have different challenges than a lot of other universities that don't have these same demographics. And our IGE grant is focused on our environmental science master's program, and it has demographics that are very similar to the universities. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a minute about my team. We had a very diverse team with regards to disciplines, so that we can make sure that all of the things that we were proposing, we would be able to accomplish. So we had 3 people from the Department of Environmental Science and Ecology, myself and Dr. Jeffrey Hutchinson and Dr. Gwen Young. We had 2 from our College of Education and Human Development in the higher ed program, Dr. Amari Nora and Juliet Ray. The great thing about Dr. Nora, he has done a lot of STEM program evaluations, and his bachelor's and master's degree were actually in biology. And then we had 2 from the Department of English, Dr. Kenneth Walker and Dr. Sue Hum. And these matched up to the activities that we wanted to do and the objectives that we wanted to do. Also, as part of the team was Dr. Benjamin Tuggle. He, at the time, was the director of the Southwest region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so it was really good to have him as part of our team. So we knew that we would know better what employers were looking for. And he agreed to be the role model and namesake of our Tuggle Scholars Program and mentor the students. And this is just a slide from, we actually received a university award for innovation and impact a few years back. Next slide, please. So before we get into evaluation and assessment, I thought it might be good to take a few minutes and talk about the pre-assessment and evaluation. What do we do before we write out our assessment plan? And so I think all of us come to the table with identifying some problem that we might have that we want to solve with, in our case, graduate education. It could be undergraduate education. And then a thorough review of the literature, what is already known about some of the issues, the barriers with regards to this, and how have other people solved it, perhaps in other disciplines. And then establish the conceptual framework. So those are really the first steps that we try to build out before we design these interventions or programs. Next slide, please. And for us, the problems that we identified, and this is with the help of our external partners like Fish and Wildlife or Forest Service, other federal agencies or other entities, that students from marginalized communities are lacking as leaders in many STEM disciplines, but specifically for us in the areas of natural resources and conservation. And more specifically, marginalized students have higher dropout rates than their non-marginalized peers. That's some of the things that we saw. And the other thing that we saw is that marginalized students have higher percentage of students that would switch from our thesis option degree plan to the non-thesis degree option plan. Next slide, please. So what we knew and learned from the literature that kind of helped with the design of our interventions, that leaders in STEM, they must have a very strong science identity. And a lot of times that's difficult for those individuals that are underrepresented in STEM disciplines or from marginalized communities. Also very important is very strong communication skills and strong leadership skills. So if you could go forward. So as we looked at some of our numbers, looked at the literature, what we came up with is 3 interventions used to help in building the science identity of our student population. One was writing pedagogy and writing to learn pedagogy that was intertwined throughout our curriculum to get the students doing writing and learning to write and learning the content through this writing. The other thing we knew that we needed to have a better grasp of is holistic mentoring. We call it holistic mentoring. It's a little bit different than maybe some of the institutions, because not only did we train faculty on our unique students and the barriers that they face and how it may be different from other institutions they've come from, but also staff, because our staff play a role and they're the face of our department. How can they be helpful in mentoring students in some ways? And then peers. And then the last intervention was public science communication. Getting the students out. Maybe we start with an elementary school, take them to conferences, and get them talking of the science. And so our thought is all of these things would help build their science identity and help them overcome the imposter syndrome. Next slide, please. So building the conceptual framework, this should always be thought of kind of as your roadmap and the foundation of your projects. You want to define those key concepts like we talked about in the previous slide. What is writing to learn pedagogy, imposter syndrome, holistic mentoring? Then establish the relationships between these key concepts. Set the boundaries. What is the scope of the study? Who is your target audience? What is the time frame over which you're going to try to accomplish these goals? And provide context. And this is the theoretical context that really requires us to get into the literature, and it may not be the literature of the discipline that we're used to reading, but it's important to see the theoretical content of this. And this is where my colleagues from the higher education department and the writing to learn pedagogy department really were important, because it's theory and content of things that I'm not really familiar with in my work. And then this will help guide your research design. What are the methodologies you're going to use? How are you going to collect the data? What's the best sampling strategy? And how are you going to analyze the data? So this is really just kind of the layout and getting started with these projects. Next slide, please. So our conceptual framework was, we felt that a strong research science identity could be enhanced by training in the sciences, science writing, science mentoring, and I'm going to also call this intrusive mentoring, and then of course, persistence and graduation. So that was kind of our conceptual framework that we used. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk a little bit about the steps in the assessment and evaluation. Next slide, and we'll start by looking at the program goals and objectives, defining these program goals and objectives. Next slide. So I wanted to clarify this because this sometimes seems to be, there sometimes seems to be some misconceptions of the differences between a goal and objectives and activities, etc. But a goal is really a very broad statement of what you're trying to accomplish. And it is broad, it can be very general, it's intangible, and it's not usually pretty abstract. The objectives, it's something that we're going to use to accomplish our goals. They're much narrower, very precise, tangible, concrete, and they can be measured. And of course, the activities are really the stepping stones to meet those objectives. These can be things like workshops, networking, seminars. There are all kinds of different types of activities that you can have. Next slide, please. So with step one for our project is, as I mentioned previously, overall, we wanted to diversify the STEM workforce and then improve the success of marginalized students. This is one of our students, Julian Chavez. He's first gen high school. He's first gen bachelor's degree, and he's finishing up his master's degree right this summer. So, and I learned a lot in working with Julian and understood barriers that this population group experiences. Next slide. So as you define your program objectives, what are you aiming to achieve and what are the outcomes that you're hoping to see? Next slide. So for us, based on our literature, we knew that increasing student engagement increased student success. So we wanted to increase student engagement and increase students' self-efficacy, definitely improve our content learning, improve the science communication, help them develop those leadership skills, and improve faculty understanding of mentoring marginalized students, which can really be a problem in a lot of cases. Oftentimes, it's the faculty that need more work than the students. More broadly, we wanted to increase science identity, increase persistence in graduation, and increase the number of students completing the independent research projects. Because in talking with our external partners, we learned that it's those students that can do the independent research that are going to become the leaders in these jobs. And that's really what we wanted, is to create leaders, not just necessarily a graduate. Next slide. So the next is to establish the assessment criteria. Next slide. So perhaps most of you have seen these before, the SMART steps. And I use this when I evaluate staff, for example, and in their annual evaluation. But you can use it to establish our assessment criteria. They should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and some kind of time bound. Next slide. More specifically, if we look at the specific, the first in the acronym specific. So you need to define exactly what it means to have reached a milestone. So it has to be specific. It has to be something that you can measure. Quantify and correlate the progress towards one of those objectives, and use metrics and your KPIs, your key performance indicators. It has to be achievable. Ensure the objective is realistic. Do you have the resources? What are the problems and expectations that you have? And plan the most effective path. It has to be relevant. Choose objectives that are high priority. They're well-timed, and they should also have both short and long-term impact. And consider how risk and other factors may change these. And finally, time-bound. Add a time restraint to prioritize the task to support the goal and make measuring efforts more effective. Next slide. So here is just an example of an assessment criteria. I've read this recently. I have students write grants as they learn to write write grants. And so this is one that's tweaked a little bit, but this was one of them. So the objective for this particular project is we want to increase the number of marginalized graduate students recruited and trained in our master's program. And so the assessment criteria is, are marginalized graduate students adequately recruited and trained to join a diverse and competent workforce? So again, I use this as an example. To me, it seems like a no-brainer, but because I've just read it recently after, even trying to help students learn this and colleagues learn this as well. So next slide. So as you can see, this is not specific at all. Is it measurable? Next slide. It's not something that we can measure. Is it achievable? Well, yes, perhaps it's achievable. Next slide. Perhaps it's relevant. And as you can see, there's no time bound. Next slide. Yes. So this is, I thought about it after I did this, but it just seems like this is so obvious to me. But an assessment criteria should never be able to be answered with a yes or no, because you cannot tell how effective this is. And as you can see, this is a yes or no question. Are marginalized graduate students adequately recruited and trained? Yes or no? And so this is not a very good assessment criteria. Next slide. But we can tweak that. And let's try this one. The number of marginalized graduate students recruited to our master's program will increase by 5% each year for the next 5 years. And so with this, you can see that it's specific, measurable, achievable. I guess it depends on your program. For us, it's achievable, relevant, and it's time bound. So this is a much better assessment criteria, something that we want to measure our success. Next slide. So linking project activities to the program objectives. The next slide. So the next thing we want to do is we have all of these activities we've designed or interventions we've designed to try to reach those objectives. And what you want to do is be able to match those to your objectives. And then that will help in overall determining if you will have an effect on your goal. So for example, one of our activities was to train faculty and staff on holistic mentoring. So we brought in experts, three experts from around the country that have researched in this area to train our faculty. And so we can map that to our objective of improving faculty mentoring of marginalized students. Now, oftentimes an activity can, it can map to several objectives. So you can keep that in mind, but it's very important to be able to try to figure out what is the purpose of this activity, because when we're trying to, at the end, see if it was effective, we know we have some way of measuring that. Next slide. Determining data collection methods and collecting the data. Next slide. So when you're collecting data for program assessment, such as this that we did, and intervention type things, a lot of times this data is very qualitative. And for me, I'm a quantitative researcher, not a qualitative researcher. That's why my team is so important. The team I put together was so important. So one way is surveys. These can be pre and post surveys of activities that you do, opinions of maybe it's family members, maybe it's faculty, maybe it's the students themselves. Next slide. Then we can move that up to focus groups. And there are a lot of rules and regulations that you need to think about with regards to your IRB and focus groups, selecting who should be interviewing, being in charge of that focus group and asking the questions, all of that. And you can find this in the literature, but it's very important to to evaluate and understand the literature and make sure you don't have biases that are built into it just by the person who's interviewing it. Next slide. And then a lot of times from a focus group, we will select a few of those individuals to dive even deeper and do one-on-one interviews. Next slide. Document analysis. We use document analysis for some of our work. And for example, trying to see if the writing is improving over time, we can analyze some of the documents that the students produce. You can also analyze the transcripts of your focus groups and interviews. So document analysis. Next slide. And then the stuff that I'm more comfortable, which is quantitative metrics, means and standard deviations, comparing a control group that did not get the intervention, the mean score, and versus that of students that receive the intervention. So, t-test, analysis of variance, those kinds of things that are much more easy for me to analyze and understand. Next slide. Analyzing the data. Okay, what do we do with this? Okay, next slide. So I'm going to talk mainly about the qualitative part of that because so much of these type of data are qualitative. And I thought that for a lot of us, this may be the part that's a little bit out of our background a little bit. But a lot of this qualitative analysis revolves around doing thematic analysis. So you collect these documents or surveys and what have you, and then you begin to look for themes that exist within these documents. So we do what's called coding, and then that helps us with the themes, and it can be an iterative process. Next slide. So I'm going to show you some different types of software that are used. I don't have a lot of experience with some of these because I'm not a qualitative researcher, but these and I don't know, I'm not, giving one a better review than the other. This is not what it's about. It's just these are some of the more popular ones that I've seen. One's called In Vivo. Next slide. One is, it's called R. This is a free software. I would imagine if you're in STEM, you probably know about R. And it's a lot of quantitative research, but you can do qualitative research with R as well. It's open sourced statistical packages. Next. Another real popular one is Atlas. This is the one my husband used for his dissertation, and he's a qualitative researcher. Next slide. SAS and JUMP, I put those together. JUMP is just the menu-driven of SAS, and SAS is an inexpensive software that a lot of universities do have. It's more equivalent to R, but it's not open source. And then SPSS, which a lot of us are familiar. So those are some of the different softwares that you might think about. Next slide. Now we have to interpret the findings. Next slide. So I just took some screenshots from some Atlas output to show you. This is what's called the coding menu. Again, you have a document. This is a transcript from an interview. You read through passages and you code different things within those passages to these different themes. And as you go, you may combine and you may disentangle a couple of the themes as you read through these documents, but it's called coding. And when a lot of the work that we've done, it's, codes, like mentoring might be a theme that would come about in coding. Finances, being able to complete school, they don't have enough money. So financial burden, familial pull. So those are just various themes. Coding menu. Next slide. This is called a sand key diagram that shows the relationships between these various themes. I'm just showing you as an example. Next slide. And this is a word cloud, probably the easiest one for me to understand, but obviously the ones that are bigger are the ones that are themes that are more important versus other themes or phrases that are less important in the overall question. Next slide, and this is what's called a tree map. And next slide. And this is something similar. It's a word cloud in vivo. Next slide. Again. All right, and then this is the stuff that I can handle a lot easier, which is means and standard deviations and t-tests and ANOVAs, etc. So those are some of the analysis. Now, excuse me. What I wanted to say is that if as you're working on these projects, if you don't know about qualitative research, you don't know about using the Sankey or tree maps and so forth. That's why it's really important to get qualitative researchers involved in your project. And again, that strength for our team came from the individuals from the higher education program, that's what their careers is evaluating programs and using qualitative research. Next slide. All right, make recommendations. Again, so when you make recommendations, after you get all of these things and let's say perhaps a theme of finances and fiscal responsibility came as a major theme, then you might want to make recommendations of creating a new activity where you have somebody from financial aid and come talk to the students. But these recommendations, they have to be practical, obviously something that you can do and feasible. You have the money and resources to do it, and it should be targeted to what you find from that previous evaluation. Next slide. And from here, we can develop action plans. And I think one thing that comes to mind when we are thinking about our grants or our projects is we put so much investment up front in designing it and creating the activities. Oftentimes we run out of funding or time to do the end, which is developing the action plan and implementing changes and making recommendations for that. So we need to remember that even though our grant monies may be running out, or we may be getting a new chair that has different ideas, that these things have to continue on. Next slide. So when you develop an action plan, what are we going to do? Are all our activities perfect to meet our objectives that will overall help us reach our goals? Or do we need to tweak it? So what are the specific steps? So you bring your team together, or if you don't have a team, it's just you. What are the specific steps that I need to take? Do I have the resources? If not, can I ask my chair for additional funding? Can I find some external monies to help me as I implement these changes? Set some timelines for them, and then assign responsibility. Next slide. And so then finally, we implement the change. Next slide. And so the changes might be to modify program components. For example, let's say that we had a workshop where we had each of the faculty members come and talk about their experiences with working with students from marginalized communities. And we find out that the workshop, when we look at our evaluation criteria and we look at our survey data, we just realize it's not effective. So that is where we would come in and modify program components. So instead of having the faculty come and talk about what it's like, maybe we have the students come in and talk what it's like to be from a marginalized population in natural resources and conservation. You have to think about reallocating resources, perhaps. Maybe we need to move it away from student activities and focus on the faculty more, because our faculty are who need the help the most. And then redesigning those processes. Next slide. And so the last three I have grouped all together here. So next slide. And this is of monitoring and evaluation, communicating those results, and it's iterative and improved. So you just continue this over and over again. And again, I think it's where the ball oftentimes gets dropped. Either we run out of money, we run out of steam, we move on to different projects. But if we want to continue to move the needle in these programs and do effective work, we really need to always be monitoring and evaluating things, communicate the results to colleagues, other departments within your university, other disciplines, other universities, workshops such as these. It's great to communicate these results. What are other people learning? And that might help you reevaluate what you're doing. And so you can always continue to iterate and improve. Next slide. So I wanted to briefly talk now about the lessons that I've learned from this project and in some cases in my career. One is, and I have a little plus or minus. The plus is things that were really positive for my project or our project. The first one is forming a team which ensures all aspects of the program can be accomplished. This was the real highlight, and it wasn't you're on the team and I'll communicate with you every once in a while. My team met when we were preparing the grant for over a year every Friday in our faculty center. And it takes a while because you have to learn each other's vocabulary, which is different for each discipline that you might need to add to your program. But having a good team will make all the difference in the world and make sure you have all the bases covered. Designing grant activities that will support your objectives. Again, very important, obviously, based on what I've said earlier in this talk, but you know, figuring out what those are. And again, you're going to be monitoring and implementing changes, and they can be tweaked. And the continuous monitoring, try to do that. It's the only way to do it, but I know that it's something that's really, really hard. Here are the difficult things and challenging things that I faced is making sure these things are sustainable. What happens when I retire? Or what happens when the grant money is gone? What happens if the chair won't give me any staff support any longer? How am I going to make this sustainable? It's a big challenge. It takes a lot of effort. And I think a lot of it can go back to the team and making sure that you can add new members of the team to help you make these things sustainable. And then finally, this last one is earning the support of those in control of the resources. Very, very important. I think when I wrote this, I probably was thinking more of internally. How do I convince my chair that I need a half-time staff position to be able to continue the monitoring and implementing changes? How do I do that? How do I convince the dean, or the provost, or somebody more internally? But also, you can rely on your external partnerships and let Fish and Wildlife, or let the Forest Service, in my case, know that what we're doing is great, and they give you more scholarship monies and so forth. All right, next slide. So that's my presentation of some of the things that I've experienced, and I hope it's been helpful, and I'll be glad to take any questions if you want to put them in the question and answer area. If you have any questions or thoughts or anything you'd like to talk about, I'd be glad to entertain.
Thank you so much, Janis.
You're welcome.
That was what I really appreciated about your presentation is how you broke down things for all of us into different parts and did not make any assumptions about what we might know or not know going into this process. And so I found it incredibly helpful. Again, like Janis said, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A part down below your screen. And I will ask those questions of Janis. I think, you know, one thing as we sort of warm up to the Q&A period, that I wanted to ask you to expand upon is how you involve an evaluation team and people with evaluation experience in the proposal development process. Something we hear about a lot is from evaluators is that they are handed a proposal that has already been funded and said, okay, here's my plan. Now we need you to evaluate the work as it goes on. And so evaluators are not necessarily given an opportunity to have a voice in the development of the plan. So
yeah, and I think that you can kind of tell that when you're a reviewer, when you read grants, that the person that's doing the evaluation was just, you know, yeah, we'll do it. You know, they haven't been a part of it. And I tried to present it in such a way that for everybody to realize it's important to have those people involved from the very beginning, you know, even in designing your activities to make sure your activities can meet those. So I think to consider, first of all, if you're from a university, to consider the people, right, the faculty at your institution that already are trained in these kinds of areas. I mean, you can go to an external consultant, you can do that, but if you already have the people at your university, faculty members, that's their strength. And so when we would meet almost every week, and maybe you don't have that kind of time commitment, but we would meet and discuss on Friday afternoons for a couple of hours from the very beginning. And we all designed even the acronym, for example. And so it was a team effort across the board. And so I think it's important to understand, as you've kind of mentioned, that these people that are going to help you with the assessment and evaluation should be involved in the beginning, because that's what they're trained in. And they'll help you to refine your objectives, refine your activities, so that you can evaluate and do assessments accurately. So it's of vital importance. Yes.
Great. Thank you. We have some questions rolling in. The first one in the Q&A is, what recommendations do you have for creating a sustainability plan that will be followed? In my experience, these plans are made, but then forgotten about.
Yes, and very true. And as you noticed in my last slide, I had a negative sign above that because of the difficulty in this. So I think you just have to find your people that buy into what you're trying to do, and then find the next generation of person that buys into what you want to do, and make sure those people are involved. And because that's where the sustainability comes from, it's really the people effort, in my opinion. I mean, obviously it's always nice to have money, but if you don't have the people to back it up, you don't even have somebody to go tell the chair, you know, is it all right if this staff person spends 2 hours a week working for us, doing some evaluation data collection or something. So I think in my experience, it's finding the people that buy into what you're trying to do. And in some cases you have to convince them, but you know, the people that thinks these types of things are important, and they want to help, and they want to do these kinds of things, and then get those on your team, and then make sure they're generational, from full professors, associate, assistant, and maybe graduate students coming behind. That would be my suggestion on that.
Great. Thank you. The next question is, how do you deal with potential bias of having institutional evaluators assess your program? Is that an issue?
So we didn't have it as an issue. Maybe it is because I don't think the results that we found or the evaluations that we got were, you know, something that the university was championing necessarily. You know, they were kind of off doing our own thing, so we weren't trying to impress anybody internally. And I think that our team just had so much experience with that, So I know that we didn't have any bias, like we're going to give Dr. Bush the answers that she wants, so she'll put us on a grant again. I didn't have that experience with these people. And I guess I could argue a little bit that even external people might want your business again anyway, so they might do the same thing. So I think if you just deal with professionals, whether it be internal faculty members that are in this area, I think you would be okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered that the best, but it is a very good question, but I've just never, I never saw that with our team.
Yeah. So there is sort of an underlying assumption in that question that is maybe related to the next question, which is that evaluators want to be involved because they are compensated in some way for their services. The next question has a different take, which is how do you get people involved in your team? How do you bring people into your team who may be incredibly busy or may not get compensation out of the grant for their work?
I think there are a couple things that you can do. If you have, and in our case, Dr. Nora, who if you look at the literature with STEM program assessments, his name will pop up a lot. So he is very busy. But oftentimes they may have doctoral students that could be involved, and you could compensate them to a certain degree, But also, I'm going to mention that it's important to try to build a culture, right? And by that, I mean that if it means a lot to you and you can use your assessment to show that there's a benefit to the program, to the university, that a lot of people will buy in and want to be part of it. So build that culture of it's our mission to do these things to help students. And then oftentimes you get people that want to participate that don't want compensation. So I think it can be twofold. If somebody is too busy, you might try to work with, in our case, we had a program director who actually was a student of Dr. Nora's, that we were able to pay off the grant a little bit later. But I do think, I think, and of course it's not as expensive as buying a couple of courses for him to get course release, right? So, but building a culture, I think, is really, really important.
Thank you. There's a related question about doing specific team or community building activities in this incredibly diverse team, which you had said was meeting once a week. How do you sort of develop trust? How do you create that shared vocabulary so that you can be as successful as possible?
Yeah, we actually we built a compact for our team. And so it was kind of rules, regulations, and it covered everything from how we were going to assign or who is contributing to writing reports to the federal the funding agency, to determining authorship on any papers that come out of it, and how meetings were going to be, run and so forth. So we actually have a governing document in our folder, and that's what it was for. So that worked. It worked for us. But I'm not going to say we didn't, at times have, a little bit of issues between two people and want to be a part of something. It happens, but if you always have that a governing document for the team to go back to, I think it really helps things. It's coming down to hiring somebody, and it was like a split vote. One group wanted two people wanted this person, two people wanted that, and hiring somebody after we interviewed everybody. So a governing document, I strongly recommend that.
Yeah. That's really good specific advice. Thank you. So another question in the Q&A, the communication of project progress and findings sounds important. What did your team do in these areas, and when during the project did they occur?
Could you read it again?
How was the communication of project progress and findings handled? So I'm going to expand a little on the question as best I can. Who did you communicate these outcomes to, and what were the feedback loops? Did you communicate them to participants, for example, or did this stay just internal to the team?
Yeah, so no, it wasn't just internal to the team. And in some cases, we would share with participants. And so, first of all, of course, everybody has to be careful, make sure you follow all your IRB rules and regulations and so forth. But, you know, leading up to the design and for the first couple of years of implementation is when the grant team really met more frequently. I would say before we met weekly as we're writing the grant and learning each other's vocabulary. And then when the activities and such, we didn't meet as frequently, but we all participated in various activities with the students and so forth. And then after that, it moves into more of, I would say a lot of times now it's email communication, right? Here's a new survey instrument we're going to use. Dr. Nora and Dr. King-Kostelak have already reviewed it. If y'all have any input, and of course, those were our evaluators, the people that are really good at evaluating and know how to even write a question. And so as time has moved on, I do think we broke out a little bit. Like, so the writing to learn people, they wrote their own papers related to how this can be used. So very intense at the beginning, but still communicative, you know, but more, and I guess part of that could be a combination of dealing with COVID too, as I think about it. But yeah, I mean, we don't need to have a meeting to go over a survey instrument that we can all look at, you know, via email.
Yeah. One just final question before we move to our conclusion here. We had a follow-up question that was clarifying based on clarifying question on the question about bias.
Mm-hmm.
This person was saying they're not thinking about potential bias by evaluators wishing to be asked back on a future grant, but rather that a university would like to show that a program was effective for the hope of continued funding. I have seen this as a concern on panels before, this person writes, so I have been struggling about whether I should still use internal evaluators.
Ooh, wow. Let me think about that. So if we're talking about, you know, various milestones throughout the grant, so I think if you get a positive evaluation, this would be kind of my take on it. If you get a positive evaluation, then that's like we need to continue the funding. If we don't get a positive evaluation, but we get useful data that tells us we need to implement these changes, then that's another reason to still fund it, right? We're going to implement based on our review or our evaluation. These areas need to be tweaked, and these are what we want to do. These are the new changes we want to add, and so I think you could almost argue either way that you should if it's positive, you need the money to continue. If it's not positive, you need the money to make the changes to keep going. That would be my take on it. That's how I would sell it to my administrators.
Thank you so much, Janis, and to all those who have been a part of this conversation with us and have asked questions. Really, thank you for sharing what you've learned in such an honest and helpful way. And once again, we'll be sharing this recording on the IGE Hub website and sending out the slide deck to all of our participants. Before we do that, I'll turn it over to Christine Thompson to wrap us up.
Great, thank you, Julia. Just making sure you can hear me. I just switched to my headphones. Okay, great, thank you. All right, so thank you again to Janis for sharing her expertise with us today. I want to share also some current and upcoming opportunities that some of you may be familiar with. So 2 of the items are for active awardees. Please share your posters, your project posters to myself. My email address and Julia's email address will be on the last slide. This is from our PI meeting that we held in February. We are still fielding project posters, and for everyone else, there is a virtual project poster hall on the IGE Hub site from the NSF PI meeting in February. Also, for active awardees, you now have access to the password protected directory on the Hub site. So please access that. You'll be able to engage with other active awardees in the IGE program. And lastly, that the middle circle there is joining our IGE LinkedIn group. If you could advance to the next slide. Great, thank you. So if you're interested, any of you are interested in engaging and sharing resources with the STEM graduate education community, we have developed an IGE LinkedIn group page. So there's 2 ways to access it. You can either go to LinkedIn and search for directly that image on the side, Innovations in Graduate Education IGE, or you can take your phone and scan this QR code and it will take you directly to that page where you can request to be invited. Again, this is open to everyone and first connection. So if you can think of anyone in your network that could benefit from actively engaging with innovative ideas in STEM graduate education, let us know, or actually just send the invite and we'll accept. And the last page is just our emails here. So you will see mine and Julia's email. If you have any questions at all about this webinar or additional questions about the IGE Hub page or the program, please let us know. Every attendee today will receive a post-webinar survey. It should be about 9 total questions. So if you could please fill that out as soon as you're able to, keep it top of mind. That survey will be going out at the end of this meeting. So that's all I have. Julia, anything else? No, you're muted.
Just repeating our big thank you to you all, and I hope to see you on LinkedIn and at our next event, which we'll be sharing in the IGE Insider. Thank you.